All right, what I'd like to talk about today comes from your textbook chapter 15.1, and that is the origin of new species. And I think I briefly mentioned this last time, but remember that Darwin's book, which he published in 1859, was actually titled The Origin of Species, but he really didn't focus that much on the mechanisms behind speciation, as we call it. Instead, his main themes were, number one, to convince people of the concept that evolution or change had actually occurred among species on Earth. And secondly, to propose a mechanism that drove that change, and that mechanism is what he called natural selection. So what we're going to talk about today actually is a little more focused than these two broad categories. We're going to talk about what is technically called speciation, i.e. the development of new species from ancestral species. And in order to talk about that, we have to define what a species is. So to most people, a species is a particular kind of organism, and typically this group of organisms shares a number of common characteristics. And that might be appearance, structure, behavior, and so on. Biologists actually use more specific types of definitions. And in fact, the definition that I'm going to give you is actually referred to as the biological species concept. And by definition, a species is a group of populations that potentially or actually interbreed and produce viable offspring that themselves can reproduce. And another way to say that is to say that the offspring are fertile. So the focus on this definition is on the ability of all the organisms within this group of populations, to interbreed. a corollary to this definition, which I'll put up here, is that members of a species cannot breed with other species to produce fertile offspring. So the focus really is on what we call reproductive isolation. In other words, species are separated from each other due to the fact that they cannot reproduce with other species. Speciation is an example of a type of evolution that we call macro evolution. So the development of new species and groups larger than that, classes, orders, families. That is in contrast to what we've been talking about, which is sometimes called microevolution. And microevolution is defined as changes in the gene pool of a population. Of organisms. Okay, one other concept I want to bring into this, and then we'll talk about examples, cases in which we can see how two species maintain separate reproductive abilities. Okay, let's go back to Darwin. As I mentioned, Darwin didn't talk about or use the term speciation. He actually used a different term, and that term is descent with modification. And that's from The Origin of Species. And basically this, he illustrated this concept in diagram, and I think I've done this before with you, but we can start with, so this is time over here, and we can start with an ancestral species, and let's just say it's species A. And over thousands and perhaps millions of years, perhaps that ancestral species, the populations for some reason separate, and over time find themselves in different environments, and therefore through natural selection become very different from the ancestral species. And so we see the development of two species, we'll say modern species, from this one original ancestral species. And so this is what we call what he called descent. So these are the descendants, and these are the ancestors here, and with modification. And modification because he focused on natural selection, really is adaptation. So adaptations to the environment. All right, what I'm going to do now is to list a number of categories that are ways in which two similar species can maintain reproductive isolation, and then we'll talk about each in turn. Okay, so I've got 5. So these are, this is ways in which species maintain reproductive isolation. In other words, how do we keep two species, perhaps they're very similar in appearance, how do those species maintain their isolation? Why don't we see interbreeding between them? And there's several different explanations. Number 1 is habitat. We can see, or habitat isolation, I guess is the best way to put that.